Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. We were deliberating where to hold this event, whether here or C103. In 5 minutes, we made a mistake and moved here. So bear with us. My name is Asher Kaufman, and I'm the director of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. We are now a month away from the start of the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And if you follow the news, you also know that the ceasefire has been shaky and violated a few times, both by Israel and Hamas. We're also 2 years and a month from October 7th, 2023, the day Hamas and other Palestinians launched their attack on Israel, leading to this long war. That day, where 1,200 people were killed and 251 were abducted to the Gaza Strip, still reverberates in Israel as the most traumatic and one of the most consequential days in the history of the state. It led to Israel's devastating war on the Gaza Strip, with now at least 70,000 people dead and almost a complete ruin of infrastructure, from houses to schools, hospitals, mosques, water and electrical systems, and much more. Israeli actions in the Gaza Strip have been labeled genocide by multiple human rights organizations, including 2 Israeli organizations that were the focus of an earlier panel we held here at Kroc in August. In the West Bank, Jewish settlers, supported by the Israeli government, are actively targeting Palestinians, and particularly shepherd communities, violently forcing them to leave their habitats, their houses, and settlers there operate with complete impunity. The last 2 years have transformed the Middle East in unprecedented ways. The war between Israel and Hezbollah that concluded a year ago in November 2024 led to the diminished power of the Shia organization and to the establishment of a government in Beirut that for the first time in decades is attempting to curb the power of Hezbollah and reassert state authority across the country. In Syria, the Assad regime is gone, and the new government is trying to establish its authority over this war-torn state with multiple challenges. And the 12-day war between Israel and Iran over the summer was unprecedented in multiple ways, weakening the government in Tehran and in fact positioning Israel, for now at least, as a military hegemon in the entire Middle East. And the ceasefire itself, the first stage in this so-called Trump peace plan, brought to the fore for a regional coalition of really strange bedfellows, Turkey, Qatar, and Egypt, that were able to work together with the United States and exert pressure on both Israel and the Hamas to agree on the shaky terms of this ceasefire. With us today to unpack some of these issues are our speakers, Mkhaimar Abusada, associate professor in Al-Azhar University in Gaza, which is now, I think, the first university to reopen its gates in Gaza after the ceasefire. And Mkhaimar is joining us from Cairo via Zoom. You can see him on screen. Natalia Omer, professor of religion, conflict, and peace studies. Laurie Nathan, professor of the practice of mediation and director of the mediation program at Kroc. Rami Khouri, distinguished public fellow at the American University of Beirut, who also joins us on Zoom, I think from Beirut, am I right?
No, from Cambridge, Massachusetts, the USA.
Oh, Cambridge, Massachusetts, okay. And myself included, obviously. Each one of us will speak for about 8 to 10 minutes, which will leave us ample time for Q&A. So we'll start with Mkhaimar on Zoom. Please, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, many thanks, Professor Asher Kaufman. Let me first, I guess I'm being heard. Is everything okay?
Yeah, maybe turn up the Zoom, the volume.
Okay, great. Let me just thank you, Asher, and thank the Kroc Institute for inviting me to be part of this panel. And I would like also to express my honor to be with the other colleagues on this panel Lauri, Nathan, Atalia, Omer, and Rami, Khouri. It's a pleasure to be with all of you, and it's really an honor. Going directly into the subject, I am a Palestinian from the Gaza Strip, and I was in the Gaza Strip all the way until the war erupted. When the war erupted on October 7th of 2023, I was in Gaza, and I was evacuated about 40 days after the eruption of the war with my family, with my wife and kids, out of Gaza into Egypt. And I have been living in between Egypt and the US over the past 2 years. Speaking about Gaza, it's you cannot really speak about Gaza without, being heartbroken. First of all, I lost some family members in this war. I lost some of my nephews and their mother and some of their little children. We lost them at the beginning of this war. Also, I've lost many other relatives, and I think that very much includes every single Palestinian family in the Gaza Strip over the past 2 years, where the Palestinians have suffered immensely. That also to be said also. The suffering of the Israelis on October 7th, that definitely wasn't an easy day for the Israelis. October 7 of 2023. Now, speaking about Gaza, let me say that I think it was for the first time since the eruption of the war that the Israeli government and the Israeli army allowed foreign journalists to enter the Gaza Strip with the escort of the Israeli army. I mean, these foreign journalists were not on their own, and they were not even allowed to go into the areas under the Hamas control. A report that I read today by BBC English, one of their correspondents was able to get into Gaza, and basically he was describing the situation in Gaza from a top hill, in which he very much said that what he could see from Beit Hanun, which is all the way north of Gaza, all the way to the south of Gaza City, speaking about 20 kilometers from that area all the way to the south of Gaza City. He very much described the situation as the only thing that he can see from that top hill is just destruction and rubble. That was the only thing that he could see. And again, I think as we are going to expect to see more journalists to view the damage and the destruction in Gaza, I think I'm not probably exaggerating here if I say that the destruction that was inflicted on Gaza over the past 2 years probably is much more than any other place since World War II. I do not recall, or I do not remember that any destruction has been inflicted on a city like Gaza since World War II. According to many UN agencies, roughly we're talking about 80%, if not more, of the Gaza homes, Gaza infrastructure, including my family home, which was very much destroyed during this war, and many of my siblings' homes were also lost. So basically, we're talking about 80% of Gaza homes, Gaza schools, Gaza universities, and civilian infrastructure is very much gone, has been very much destroyed. And I think there is an estimation of about 60 million tons of rubble in Gaza now. After 2 years of war, that's about even more than 60 million tons of rubble that will probably need, I guess, many years to be removed and to be taken somewhere else. And that is even the question what to do with that rubble, whether to build an island on the Mediterranean with that 60 million tons of rubble, or do something else. And that is just one of the faces that Gaza has seen. And I think according to going back to the BBC journalist who basically started his piece by saying that this place was at one point was a place, a city with full of life, with full of memories, and now all of that is very much gone. That, as I mentioned, has been turned into a piece of rubble. And what even breaks my heart, to be honest with you, is that for the past 2 years, about 650,000 school kids we're out in the streets. We're not in the classroom. We're not taking any classes. Not to mention about also more than 50,000 college students who were not also able to attend classes or lectures. And as you very much said, Asher, at the opening of this panel, I think, to the best of my knowledge, that Al-Azhar University is probably the only university that still has some standing buildings where I work. Now, Al-Azhar has two campuses, one a new campus on the old city of Netzarim, which has been completely destroyed and demolished because Netzarim became again a military base for the Israeli army. Now, the old campus is still standing, but it's going to take a lot of time for the building to be rehabilitated. Now, to go away from describing the situation that is now, which is, in my opinion, it's a human tragedy. As I mentioned, still the more than 80% of the 2 million Palestinians are still basically living in tents, living in the middle of the streets, basically. Now, some of those Palestinian families went back to their destroyed homes, and to the best of my knowledge, a home fell off on the heads of its residents because the building was shaky, and the Palestinian residents went on that building, and that there are still some Palestinians under the rubble of that building because they have no place to go. Going into what's going on right now, let me basically say that we all are waiting to see what the U.S. is going to do with the U.S. President Donald Trump 20 points plan, which has succeeded so far to bring about a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel about a month ago. Even though the ceasefire is fragile, it has been violated by both, by Hamas and by the Israeli army. And I don't want to mention how many times this ceasefire has been broken, but at least it's still holding. And I think the U.S. has a lot of invested efforts in keeping this ceasefire alive between Hamas and Israel. But I think what we all focusing now on the debates that are going to take place in the UN Security Council to basically pass a Security Council resolution to deploy an international stabilization force that will be mandated with the stabilization of Gaza, disarmament of Hamas, monitoring the borders between Gaza and Israel, Gaza and Egypt, training a police force, a local Palestinian force to take care of security in the Gaza streets. That's all to be seen. Again, to the best of my knowledge, there are some disagreements between the U.S. and its Arab and regional partners on the scope or the mandate of that ISF, International Stabilization Force. But again, it will be seen. If I have more time, let me also mention something here about the current state of affairs among the Palestinians. Unfortunately, let me say that the Palestinians are in politically speaking, are in still disorganized, haven't succeeded to bring about an organization of their internal house. Let me just remind you and remind your audience here that there has been a Palestinian internal divide between the two competing political factions, Fatah, which is ruling the West Bank in Gaza, and Hamas, which was a de facto government in Gaza since the summer of 2007. So the Palestinians have very much been living in two separate, divided political entities. Again, one was ruled by the PA, the Palestinian Authority, which was led by Fatah, the party of President Mahmoud Abbas, and the Gaza Strip has been and still is being ruled by Hamas. There has been a lot of efforts by Egypt and other regional countries to try to bring about an end to the Palestinian internal divide. That hasn't succeeded yet, even though that Hamas has basically accepted the Trump plan and has basically said that they are willing to give up their control of the Gaza Strip and they are not willing to play any political role of the future of Gaza, but that's still to be seen. Egypt at the current moment has been working with the Palestinian factions, with Fatah and Hamas, to try to come up with a Palestinian technocratic committee as stipulated for in the Trump 20 points plan that will govern Gaza in the transitional period.
Mkhaimar, may I ask you to wrap up? Yes. May I ask you to wrap up?
Less than a minute. So this technocratic committee will supposedly will govern Gaza in the transitional period. Again, there are still disagreement between Hamas and Fatah and with regard to the making of this committee. But again, there are so many unanswered questions where Gaza is heading and where Palestine is heading. Thanks again for allowing me or giving me this opportunity.
Thank you.
Okay. Can you hear me okay? All right. Okay, so really great honor to be a part of this panel, this conversation. I will frame my remarks around 4 interrelated points. First, the ceasefire lacks any framework for holding accountable fugitive war criminals and genociders with warrants from the International Criminal Court, namely, Netanyahu, Gallant, etc. And there is also a provisional ruling from the International Court of Justice that Israel is possibly guilty of genocide. Since the issuance in January 2024 of this ruling has been supported by multiple reports from Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur for the Palestinian Occupied Territories, human rights organizations like Asher mentioned, independent investigations, including those by Israeli human rights organizations, and experts in genocide studies, as well as genocide studies professional associations. Further, we all watched with our own eyes on our phones the genocide live streamed, even if we were told, due to the weaponization of anti-Semitism, that the genocidal assault on Gaza is justified in terms of self-defense and Jewish safety. The agreement that we are here talking about calls for demilitarizing and removing Hamas from leadership, yet the genociders remain in power, even if increasingly isolated in the world. The absence of accountability for a genocide and the persistent denialism in the Israeli discourse of the genocide, along with the acceleration of violence in the West Bank, is a really cause of concern, and we really need to name what we are talking about, and also ask the question of why it's not named. We cannot normalize genocide. If we do, as Noura Erakat said recently, we have nothing left, especially since we are talking in a peace institute. But the ceasefire frame and the rhetoric surrounding it do just that, normalize genocide through a return to profoundly diminished concepts of peace and reconstruction. Critically, no demands are put on Israel to contribute to the reconstruction. Indeed, no such demand were ever imposed during the so-called cyclical mowing the lawn policy in Gaza, where every few years Israel mowed the lawns, as it's referred to, in a way that was designed to contain and manage Gaza, which also has served as a laboratory for surveillance technologies, AI, warfare, and other weapons that are now battle-tested and constitute a source of profitable export. There is a whole economy here that needs to be unpacked and exposed, and indeed Francesca Albanese's most recent report tackles the profiteering of the genocide, as does, of course, Anthony Lowenstein in his work on the Palestine laboratory and subsequent work. So the language of the ceasefire, together with the continuous impunity which Israel has enjoyed for decades, regardless of its many violations of international law and conventions, especially with the US veto shielding it in the UN Security Council, exposes how the language of peace and pacification is used, while the reality on the ground is one of actually a repackaged genocide and continuous land theft. Just in terms of numbers, so over 50% of the Gaza Strip is occupied by Israel now, with and the imposition of an imaginary line called the Yellow Line. Anyone who crosses it becomes a target for assassination. Meanwhile, as I'm sure that all of you know, there is the Green Line that separates so-called proper Israel from the territories Israel occupied in 1967. And this line, the Green Line, is eroded with facts on the ground that were created by the government-sanctioned settlers movement. So the facts on the ground amounting for quite a while, but accelerated, as Asher mentioned, during the genocide and recently also. We have a reality of a de facto annexation, which of course amounts to a violation of international law. So since October 10th, when the ceasefire came into effect, over, at least last I checked, over 241 Gazans have been killed, and only 100 trucks on average per day enter. The stipulation in the agreement was for 600 trucks daily, which is a bare minimum to provide a semblance of dignity and recovery for the starved population of Gaza. Critically, humanitarian assistance is a right, a human right, not a prize or something to be negotiated. Gaza has been and was a humanitarian crisis before the genocide. This crisis was an upshot of international policies and also what Sarah Roy famously called de-development, which was juxtaposed with the language of development that was deployed vis-a-vis the PA and the West Bank, and kind of encouraging Palestinians to demonstrate that they are really, really able to have their own state. So that you had the language of development in West Bank and language and policies of de-development in Gaza for decades. And I really highly recommend the work of Sarah Roy. Both types of policies, de-development and development, contributed to the fragmentation of Palestinians with the intentionality of depoliticizing the Palestinian struggle. Second point, one needs to examine this ceasefire within a deeper historical context. Oh yes, context, that dreaded word. There is a long history of Israeli insistence on a phased approach to such agreements, which usually do not move beyond the first and immediate phase under a variety of pretexts and accusations of violations and so forth. Such agreements have always prioritized Israeli demands and concerns. This one is no different, though it also involves other agendas motivated by real estate developers' agenda, truly illuminating the links between the logic of settler colonialism and gentrification. Indeed, language of like urban revival or whatever renewal is deployed in the context of referring to Gaza right now. The lack of accountability for the genocide and its repackaging into a lower intensity one reflects how this agreement, like others before it, facilitates a move from the root causes of the violence, which before October 7th, many human rights organizations, including B'Tselem, the Israeli one, they called it apartheid, which is a crime in international law. B'Tselem defined the entire geography from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea as operative under the principle of Jewish supremacy. That means Jewish people in this geography have more rights than non-Jews. And then it varies according to which geography, within this geography we talk about. This together with the continuous depopulation of the land is bypassed and ignored in the ceasefire framing because we only talk about Gaza. The Gaza genocide is a continuation of the Nakba, or the original sin, if you will, of the uprooting of Palestinians from their lands in 1947-49, though it started prior to this and has continued since through gradual tactics that occasionally accelerated in terms of gaining more land while depopulating Palestinians from this land. So since the Nakba, and yet accelerated during the Oslo so-called peace process, years that lasted for 30 years, from 1993 to basically 2023, Palestinian geographies became further and further fragmented. And so the fact that the current agreement can extract the case of Gaza and its control from the rest of Palestine reflects the operative force of the colonial logic that differentiated the Palestinians of Gaza from the West Bank, occupied East Jerusalem, the Palestinian citizens of Israel, and those in refugee camps and in the diasporas. Third point, the US. Indeed, while the US and Trump orchestrated the ceasefire and hostages exchange deal, the US is complicit through and through, and so Palestinians were in a position to negotiate the end of their genocide and with their genociders. At the same time that Trump declared the end of 3,000-year conflict, in his words, Palestinian officials had their visas in the US revoked. Human rights groups from Al-Azhar to the Palestinian Center for Human Rights still face sanctions, along with Francesca Albanese. These are sanctions by the US, the same government that negotiated this agreement without consulting Palestinians, and the same government that also rescinded sanctions imposed on extremely violent Israeli settlers. Further, deciding for Palestinians how their future will look clearly echoes 19th and early 20th century colonialism, and the rehabilitation of Tony Blair as someone to govern Gaza as a war criminal is deeply concerning. Finally, the reductive discourse about this agreement amounting to a resolution of a 3,000-year conflict is, of course, ignorant. It also connects the work done by the first Trump administration to bypass the Palestinian struggle for self-determination and freedom by normalizing Israel in the region through a series of economic and military agreements called the Abraham Accords. That likely play on the simplistic and reductive narrative that somehow the cause of the violence is religious, not colonial and political, and further, an Orientalist move that assimilates the distinct struggle of Palestinians into a broader abstract playing field of the Arab countries, quote unquote. There is a long legacy of bypassing Palestinians in this way, including through other peace agreements, regional peace agreements, such as the one signed with Egypt years ago. The close coordination with an involvement of Gulf countries and others points to this doubling down on the reductive use of religion and something called these Abrahamic traditions to continue to depoliticize Palestinians and diminish their national movement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Talia. Laurie, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Asha. Hello, everyone. I express my solidarity with the Palestinian people and share their heartbreak and anger. There has been a great deal of political criticism of the Gaza ceasefire plan, and I'm not going to cover that ground. Instead, I want to focus on the technical deficiencies from a ceasefire specialist perspective. This has been much less covered in the popular media. The technical features of a ceasefire are always critical because they are an inherently risky and dangerous type of peace agreement. They require cooperation and they require constraint from armed groups that have been in the business of killing each other and that continue to hate each other with passion and that deeply and profoundly mistrust each other. So you can see in the nature of the logic of a ceasefire that there is inherent extreme risk. It's therefore no surprise that ceasefire signatories, if one looks at the comparative research, frequently commit violations, and they do this for a variety of reasons, in order to advance their goals, or to take advantage of their enemy, or to test the limits of the ceasefire, or to satisfy their own constituencies. And indeed, quite often ceasefires are violated inadvertently because commanders on the ground are insufficiently aware of the precise rules and procedures that they need to follow. So as a result of this defining feature of a ceasefire as deeply risky, the essence of a good ceasefire design is management and reduction of risk. Reduction and management of risk. The assumption in good ceasefire design is never there will be no violations. The assumption always in good ceasefire design is that there will be many violations. And the aim of the ceasefire design is to ensure that when violations happen, the ceasefire architecture can prevent reprisals, can prevent escalation, and can prevent the complete collapse of the ceasefire. From a technical perspective, there are well-known and relatively reliable mechanisms for achieving this reduction and management of risk. And by these technical standards, the Gaza ceasefire plan really deserves no more than a F grade. I mean, it looks amateurish, it looks lackadaisical, it looks like it was drafted by people who had no idea whatsoever of the essential logic and comparative research and practice on ceasefires. There are three essential mechanisms for reducing and managing risk in a ceasefire. The first, I'll speak briefly about each of them. The first mechanism is that there need to be rigorous and precise and clear rules and procedures that govern activities that are permitted and activities that are prohibited. These rules have to be expressly, not implicitly, expressly consistent with international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and other relevant international law, and there has to be accountability for violating the ceasefire. If there is no accountability and impunity reigns, your ceasefire will simply not hold. By way of example, the 2005 Comprehensive Peace Agreement for Sudan has as much as 15 pages on ceasefire provisions. Just compare that with the Gaza ceasefire plan's 20 points, which are so thin that they look like they were never drawn up by any with any professional perspective on ceasefires. I'm not commenting on motive. Whether that was intentional or not is a question we can debate. This is just making a technical judgment on the deficiencies in the plan. The question of whether violent incidents in Gaza constitute a violation of the ceasefire or not currently depends on the personal judgment of the US President and the US Secretary of State. I mean, this is really crazy to have a ceasefire functioning on this basis. The second mechanism for a good ceasefire is a joint forum for monitoring, verification, and dispute resolution. And we see from comparative research that these commissions work best when they include senior political representatives of the conflict parties, senior military representatives of the conflict parties, selected by the parties themselves, and a third party trusted by the belligerents that plays either a mediating or adjudicating role when the ceasefire is violated or allegedly violated. And most importantly, this committee serves a dispute resolution function, which is to say, by managing in a professional, accepted way allegations of ceasefire violation, there is the hope that you can prevent reprisals and escalation. Third mechanism is an international peacekeeping force that is not only a political deterrent, but a physical deterrent. And we've seen the United Nations play that role successfully in numerous armed conflicts. The Gaza ceasefire plan provides for, quote, immediate deployment of an international stabilization force, but everybody knew that it would take weeks, if not months, if not forever, to establish this force. So there is currently and consequently no adequate deterrent against ceasefire violations. Now, the US has proposed a resolution before the UN Security Council to establish this force, but there is an absolutely vital challenge that has not been resolved and is not resolved in the draft resolution, which is as follows. Does the Gaza ceasefire plan have the full and unconditional endorsement of both the Israeli government and Hamas? If that is not the case, and it does not appear to be the case, then it's very unlikely that any country is going to be willing to join an international stabilization force and put its troops at risk. Finally, we know from research, although I'm stating a common sense, obvious political point, that ceasefires are inherently unstable if they are not linked to a process for negotiating a substantive resolution of the conflict. Ceasefires are not going to hold indefinitely. They are a means to a political end. They are not the end in themselves, however important they may be. In the case of Sudan, the conflict parties concluded a series of increasingly ambitious ceasefires, starting with a minimal ceasefire and then becoming more elaborate as they made progress in the political negotiations to end the war. In the case of Colombia, as many of you will know, the ceasefire didn't precede the conclusion of the 2016 Comprehensive Peace Agreement, but followed that. Now, the Gaza ceasefire plan fails to address this question of conflict resolution in an emphatic, clear way. It treats Palestinian self-determination and statehood simply as, quote, the aspiration of the Palestinian people. In fact, the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination and to statehood is a matter of international law. Without a commitment to a Palestinian state by Israel, by the US, and ideally also the UN Security Council, this ceasefire is simply not sustainable in the long run.
Thank you. Thank you, Laurel. Rami, we're moving forward to you. Please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much to the Kroc Institute for organizing this and inviting me. I'm delighted to be with you, and I will make some comments that are more broad in nature than the three other very excellent presentations that focused on important elements. I would just preface this by saying that I was born in 1948 in exile from our home in Nazareth because we could not return to our home in Nazareth. My father went as a journalist to New York in 1947 to cover the partition of Palestine debate, and was not allowed to go back, of course, when the Israeli state was created. But the important thing is not that I was born in 48. The important thing is that I've been involved in the Israel-Palestine conflict and resolution efforts since 1966. So it'll be 60 years next year that I've been involved in this process at college and throughout many different mechanisms, including track 2 meetings and conferences, etc., and journalistically my whole career. So I'd like to take a broad picture that looks at the important elements today, but also puts them in the context, as Atalia started to do, in the historical context, which is so critical. I just came back from a 9-day trip to Lebanon and to Qatar. And what brings those two countries together is that they were both just recently bombed by Israel using American weapons. So that's just another sidelight to this situation. It's a new thing I'm going to add to my CV. I track how many countries Israel and the US are attacking. There's about 7 of them now that have been actively involved in war in the Middle East with Israel and the United States. Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, Yemen, and now Qatar, even though Qatar was not in a war, but it was attacked by Israel. So I mentioned that because the really important thing that I see, having followed this so closely over the years, and I still follow it, is that the Gaza genocide, the joint US-Israeli joint venture genocide, has transformed the Palestine situation from a relatively sidelined issue in the last few years that at one point pushed Israel and the US to create the Abraham Accords and try to bypass the Palestine issue and make it a humanitarian issue, has changed that dynamic. And now Palestine is a global political issue and is also in many ways a global touchstone for moral and political and legal behavior. We see in many ways the 100 years of this conflict from 1917 until today, 108 years. But the 1920s and the 2020s decades are remarkably similar. We're seeing the Zionists and the British back then, the Israeli state and the Americans today, the combination of indigenous, local and Western powers practicing colonial imperial autocracy, destruction, and in some cases barbarism together and imposing their will on the whole region, and therefore generating new enemies around the region. The mistake the Israelis keep making, and the Americans have done this globally in Vietnam and Afghanistan, Iraq, and other places, now maybe Venezuela, we'll see, they keep making the mistake of not acknowledging that their military assaults generate greater resistance, and this resistance is cumulative over the decades. And we see this in Palestine so clearly, and Israel today trying to figure out, are they going to go back into Lebanon and attack Lebanon again? Because the Lebanon situation of a strong Hezbollah was a response to Israel's constant attacks on South Lebanon. When I was working there in the 1970s as a journalist, and I witnessed many of these things. And the same in Gaza, that Hamas was born in the 1980s as a response to the inability of the Palestinian political world and military world to protect Palestinians from Israeli aggressions. And the Israelis don't seem to understand that their militarism generates resistance, which generates perpetual warfare, which resonates widely among people all across the Middle East. But the really significant 2 points I want to make are that, and by the way, Asher, tell me when I have a minute left. So the really two big significant points is that this is now a global dynamic, a global political, moral, and legal dynamic in which people all over the world are supporting Palestinian rights. And what that means is Palestinian rights adjacent to Israeli state with its rights, not as Netanyahu keeps lying, as the Zionist movement has lied for decades and decades, that the Palestinians want to destroy the state of Israel, whereas the reality is that all the Arab states have repeatedly offered recognition of Israel, including Hamas. At least 16 times has offered Israel coexistence, a peaceful coexistence, if Israel accepts the rights of the Palestinians and they negotiate a resolution. I just edited a book with Helena Coben, my co-partner, called Understanding Hamas and Why That Matters, where we interviewed 5 serious scholars, Arabs and Westerners, serious scholars of Hamas, who explained in detail what Hamas is. And while we don't necessarily say we fully support Hamas, I do say that people who are confronting Hamas, Israel, American, others, should understand where Hamas came from and what it represents. If the US had done this with the Viet Cong and the Taliban and had understood better what these movements represented before engaging in war, it would have saved a lot of American money and lives and saved a lot of destruction. But this mistake is happening over and over because, like Atalia said, we are witnessing a recurring colonial dynamic. It won't go away. And my sense of what's going on now is that we are seeing a resurrection and reconfiguration of the colonialism that initially started in this area in 1917 and the 1920s. And the Americans and the Israelis with this plan, and I don't call it a peace plan, it's a proposal of the 20 points by the Israelis and the Americans, with no serious consultation with the Palestinians and consultation with some Arabs that was totally ignored when Netanyahu rewrote the 20 points. So this is colonialism at its most robust, reconfigured for the modern digital world, where the Israeli army takes Western journalists to see what's happening in Gaza, what the genocide has done, and to interpret it through the eyes of the Israeli government. So what's going on here, what I find so critical in the events today, are a couple of these points. One is the new thing that we have, which we didn't have before any time in the whole century of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or the Zionism-Arabism conflict, as I call it, because it's wider than just Israel and Palestine, as we see today with Israel's occupation of Lebanon parts and Syria and other places. The really significant new developments are, first of all, the monitoring committee, the 4-member monitoring committee for the ceasefire, imperfect as it is, and Laurie mentioned these critical technical points, but they did set up this committee, which included Turkey, Egypt, Qatar, and the US to monitor the ceasefire, and it hasn't really monitored it very significantly. There was a similar committee with France and the US to monitor the Lebanon ceasefire, and France and the US were off watching soccer games and basketball games on TV, I think. They didn't do any monitoring at all, and there was thousands of Israeli attacks and occupations of new parts of Lebanon, which just went unaddressed. But creating this new committee for the Gaza ceasefire is significant, partly because it includes Turkey, and Turkey is a NATO ally. And Turkey plays, as they call it in American diplomacy, it plays hardball.
Rami, one more minute, please.
And so that's one critical. The second critical point is the meeting that happened in Turkey last week, where 7 different countries got together to work through this discussion now taking place in the Security Council resolution about how to move to the next stage of governance and reconstruction. And the ideas being put forward, which the Security Council resolution touches on, are again a new form of colonial ambition, which is camouflaged by the fact that it's a UN resolution, things of that nature. But the global pushback against the US-Israeli genocide is so powerful now. We've seen the impact of this in public opinion surveys around the world, demonstrations, Western countries recognizing the state of Palestine on paper, and recently the American electoral impact of this with the Mamdani victory in New York mayor's election, which wasn't focused on Palestine, but the opposition to him tried to make his support for Palestine an issue, and it failed. And this is a supremely important new dynamic that is happening. And the consequence is that Israel is now carrying the mantle of South African apartheid system years ago. And so these big dynamics regionally and globally, I think, need to be appreciated. They work slowly, but they are important to watch. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rami. I will zoom in back into one particular topic, and that is I'll discuss internal Israeli matters as they have been, as I have been understanding them, as they have unfolded in recent months. So the ceasefire that we have already heard about was forced on Prime Minister Netanyahu by Trump and his bullying diplomacy. If it were up for Netanyahu, Israel's war on Gaza would have continued because it served him well politically. Like many other authoritarian populist leaders around the world, Netanyahu's first and most important interest is his own political survival. But as Trump forced Israel to stop the fighting and killing in Gaza, Netanyahu changed his own narrative and is presenting this ceasefire as the brilliance of his own political maneuvers. This despite the fact that the objectives of the war that Netanyahu himself set and reiterated time and again for the past 2 years were not achieved. These goals were destroying the governing capabilities of Hamas and destroying its military capabilities. And later in the war, the early days of the war, the government added also to create the conditions for the return of the hostages. With the absence of any Israeli strategic thinking about the end game of this war, these objectives have not been achieved and perhaps could not have been achieved. Hamas is violently asserting its dominance in the Gaza Strip, making sure that Palestinians, Israelis, and the international coalition that forced this ceasefire reckon with the fact that the organization is not going anywhere. As for the Israeli hostages, they were returned not because of Israeli actions, but despite them. If it was Trump who forced Israel to accept the terms of the ceasefire, making himself a hero among the Israeli public that for more than a year overwhelmingly wanted to end the war with a ceasefire and a hostage and prisoner exchange. The objectives of Netanyahu's religious messianic partners have not been achieved either. They wanted to reoccupy the Gaza Strip, cleanse its Palestinian population, and build Jewish settlements there. It is remarkable to see the verbal acrobatics that they are making now to reconcile with the ceasefire and justify the decision to stay in the government. They remain in the government because they have no other alternatives, because they are also able to continue their settlement project in the West Bank with more violence, more intention, and unlimited access to state resources. And they may also think that it is better for them, and they are better positioned towards the upcoming national elections in Israel from within the government rather than outside of it. There is a paradox in the position Israel is placed right now. On the one hand, as I've already said, on the military level, Israel has emerged from the past 2 years as a regional hegemon. But despite this, as others have already noted before me, despite this hegemonic position, it is also extremely fragile and vulnerable. The war has turned Israel into a pariah state with greater reliance on the US than ever before. All Israeli leaders until Netanyahu have understood that Israel's survival in the Middle East depends on military power, military deterrence, but also combined with smart diplomacy, international alliances, and soft power. Netanyahu and his government have abandoned everything but crude military force. Israel's actions in Gaza, the genocide, and the disregard for the global outcry against it are a clear demonstration of this approach. Relying mainly on military power is not entirely new in the Israeli approach, and Rami has alluded to that, but the level of disregard to diplomacy is new, and it reflects the way this government operates. And the absence of diplomacy may lead Hamas to regain power in Gaza, to Hezbollah to rearm in Lebanon, and to Iran to develop its nuclear weapons. That brings me to US-Israeli relations. Since the 1970s, there has been this conventional wisdom that the US is the only power that can put pressure on Israel with regards to the conflict with the Palestinians. Panelists have tried to answer the question, why isn't the US doing enough to end the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and make Israel change course in one way or the other? Some answer this question by suggesting that Israel for the United States is actually not foreign policy, but domestic policy, and happy to unpack this issue in our quick Q&A. But the last few months have shown that the US actually has the capacity to force Israel to change course, paradoxically perhaps. We saw that over the summer war with Iran, where on the one hand, the US obviously sided with the war, with Israel's aims in the war, but then on the last day of the war, Trump instructed Netanyahu in one phone call to order the Israeli pilots who were flying en route to strike Iran to return back to Israel. One phone call. We also saw it now with the ceasefire that was forced on Netanyahu, including the humiliating phone conversation that Trump made him make, apologizing to the Qatari Emir for the military strike that Israel conducted in Doha on September 9th, trying to kill Hamas leadership there. That was the strike that triggered the Trump administration's decision to put an end to this war. Not that Trump cared about the morality of the strike or the war in its entirety, but he cared about the financial partnerships that he was making with the Gulf states that required the quiet and stability to be pursued. And he understood Netanyahu and his government are interested in prolonging the war as long as possible. Israel is becoming even more militarily and diplomatically dependent on the United States, and it is not clear where that would lead, what that would look like when Trump is no longer in power. He will be sometime no longer in power, just FYI. The bipartisan support Israel used to have is dwindling, and even in the Republican Party, there are anti-Israeli streams. Some are motivated by US isolationism, and others are motivated by, unfortunately, overt anti-Semitism, which is a whole different thing that we can unpack if you want. Domestically, in Israel, there is immense pressure between the government and its supporters, and large sections of the population. Where is it? Large section of the population, mostly from the Zionist liberal camp. Since October 7, polls have consistently showed that about 70% of the Israeli public want this government down and to go to new elections. Despite that, the project of transforming the political system in Israel and turning it into a semi-authoritarian state in the service of Netanyahu and the religious right is still happening full steam ahead. This initiative, which started in January 2022, sparked the largest and longest anti-government movement in Israel, and in the last year it also became interconnected with the call to end the war and make Netanyahu and his government accountable for October 7th and its aftermath. Of course, this protest movement was not really concerned with the crimes that Israel was committing in Gaza. The next few months in Israel until the national elections will be detrimental, as Netanyahu and his far and his right-wing Messianic coalition will try to make sure that they win these elections by any means necessary, to borrow from a popular term these days. I want to conclude with history. 2 days ago, on November 4th, we marked the 30th anniversary of the assassination of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin by a Jewish right-wing religious settler, and that was commemorated in Israel. Rabin was one of the architects of the Oslo Accords of the 1990s, and his assassination was one of the main reasons for the derailment of that Oslo process. It is not surprising that government officials did not attend that anniversary ceremonies, including Netanyahu himself, who 30 years ago played a critical role in inciting Jewish violence that led to Rabin's assassination. The Oslo Accords have been vilified by both Palestinians and the Israelis for diametrically different reasons. If you're looking for common grounds between Israeli Palestinians and Palestinians, look for how they treat the Oslo Accords. I'm bringing up Oslo now because we should consider the fact that the big spoilers of those accords, as problematic as they may have been, the big spoilers were Jewish religious settlers on the Israeli side and Hamas and Islamic Jihad on the Palestinian side. And they are now the two parties that are calling the shots on both sides of this conflict. I would argue that they even need each other, feeding off each other's ideology and violence. For now, at least, Hamas and the settler movement are the ones that are determining the present and shaping the future of this conflict. And I will end with that optimistic note. We have ample time for questions.
You can just speak into the mic.
Thank you so much. This is very informative. I have lots of Jewish friends, I have lots of Palestinian friends, and I see both from talking with them as well as, I don't know if you're familiar with the Ask Project by Khouri Gil Schuster, where he goes into Palestinian areas, into Israeli areas, and asks them questions, the same questions of both sides. I see both sides extremely dug into their positions that this is our land, we're not to share it. I disagree with the religious aspect that, yes, it's land-based, but they're using religion to say that God or Allah gave it to us, and therefore we cannot share it. I ask Palestinian friends, well, what do you mean by from the river to the sea? Well, just that, we want freedom. Well, what would you do with the Jews that are living there? Well, they can go back to Poland, as if that's actually a solution. On the other side, I see the settlers. You look back at the 1950 law of return, there just isn't enough land. It's a finite area to invite all Jews of the world to live there. So the only way to achieve that is to expand. And that seems to be what they're doing now. So I guess I just ask you, what is the solution if we have both sides so dug in and not willing to share?
Can you introduce yourself?
Oh, of course. Anthony Basole, I'm an alumni.
Do we want to take several questions or?
Yeah, I mean, we can. You're asking what is the solution to the conflict?
In so many words, if we have spoken, so dug in, how can you get this?
Yeah.
I can start with this. I mean, this is where it is very important to be historical, because in fact, before, like, I really appreciated Rami putting kind of the beginning of of the so-called conflict, because we want to, like in my classes, we interrogate like whether this is the right word. In 1917, when a British lord promised the land for a Jewish nation, for a Jewish national home. But if you go, when you go to that moment in time, you see that, for centuries, and it's not only Palestine, it's in the broader region. You had Jews, Muslims, Christians, whatever, living, the communities are interwoven, they lived with one another. And in fact, that distinguishing those communities by their religious affiliation, this is an act of kind of the colonialism entering, Western Christian colonialism entering that space for the purpose of divide and conquer. And so it really is important to connect, for instance, to histories, like I call it counter-archival histories, that looks of people, like for instance, Avi Schleim's memoir, who talks about Iraq, and Baghdad was a Jewish city, and because there were so many Jews there, but they were not, when you ask people who they are, they said, we are Baghdadi, we are from Baghdad, we are not like, yes, they were also Jewish. So the point is that very discourse and framing of two lands, one land, two people, is a product of a particular narrative, particular history, and really has to be disruptive. You brought one particular kind of like binary, example of a binary that is a little bit, in a sense, kind of caricature what we are talking about, and also making it in many respects ahistorical, putting it in a whole different kind of like culturalist frame, rather than actually looking at, there were processes of displacement, processes, and this is not to discount that there is also nationalism and nationalist sentiments, and people experience it in a particular way, but it really is very important to be political, historical, rooted, and I can tell you that there are people on the ground, Jewish Israelis, who are thinking concretely about what would it mean to address the root cause, which is, and concretely, pragmatically, to have, Palestinian really enact the right of return because they were displaced. And so this is just to say that I would be very careful about like abstracting the conversation in that way.
I can share my own thoughts.
We can go.
Yes, and then we can go to the. I have a slightly different, broader viewpoint of the conflict and the history of the conflict than Atalia. But for me, as a historian, I make in my mental mind, I make a distinction. There is the historical analysis, and then there is the current moment that has to be reckoned with. And when I think about the current moment, I wear my pragmatic hat. And okay, there is this history of violence, history of colonialism, history of nationalism, because there is such a thing, a viable, strong Jewish nationalism, as much as there is such a thing as a viable, strong Palestinian nationalism. So when I go to the question of, how do you get out of this mess, I move to my pragmatic vision. There is this reality today, and then these two communities need to figure out how to share the land. And I have my own formula, nobody listens to me, but that's how I see it. And the historical point that Atalia, or the historical analysis that Atalia is making, is very, 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 very important. But I'm always also thinking, okay, I once had a conversation with Laurie. No, I invited Laurie to speak to my class on mediation. And he brought up this tension between the question of justice, question of history of conflicts, and then you are approaching the conflict from a point of view of a mediator. And Laurie told my class, I send the historians to the other room to duke it out, and then we have to deal with the current moment. So that's my general thinking about how to approach this conflict, but I don't see that, the vision of sharing the land is an ideal that I just don't see how that could happen at this climate.
I think that Rami kind of alluded to those, to this particular histories of thinking about sharing the land, even though it was colonized. Rami?
Yeah, thank you. This is a topic that needs another hour and a half, but I did an exercise about right after Oslo, I guess in 1995 or 98 or something, and I was living in Jordan, and I went and interviewed 25 Israelis from all this political spectrum and 25 Palestinians, again, from all the political spectrum. And I asked them the same questions. I said, what's your bottom line? What do you need to have a permanent peace with the Palestinians? And what do you expect from the Palestinians? I asked both sides the same thing, and they were remarkably pragmatic, even some of the right-wing Israelis who admitted that, yes, we carried out, ethnic cleansing in 1948. We had no choice, the usual stories. But both sides basically said that there could be a peace agreement that's permanent if both sides got their minimum bottom line. The minimum bottom line for the Israelis was that they needed to be recognized as living rightfully in that land. That they, the phrase that was used by the great Harvard political psychologist who did a piece, Henry, I forget his name,
Kelman?
Yes, Herb Kelman. Herb Kelman summarizes beautifully, God bless him and rest his soul. He said the Israelis just want to be told that they belong there. They belong in that land. This is what the Israelis believe, and they want the Arabs the Palestinians to tell them the same thing. And the Palestinians said that we need an admission from the Israeli people and government that what they did to us in 47, 48, and what they started to do in 1917 when the land was 93% Arab, including my family in Palestine, and 7% Jewish. And we want an admission, an acknowledgement from the Israelis what they did, to accept responsibility for what they did, a kind of truth and reconciliation process. And in return, we don't expect to all go back to Palestine, but we need that starting point, and then the rest can be resolved. And in fact, the Arab countries, including the Palestinians, including Hamas, have all recognized the outlines of a two-state solution that is in the Arab peace plan. But Israel has to make huge changes about withdrawal from land and exchange of land, an acknowledgement, and refugee rights. Resolving refugeehood is the core dilemma and the core pain of Palestinians. It's not territory, it's not might, it's refugeehood and exile. They were made by the colonial British to feel, with the Zionists, to feel that they were invisible people. They didn't exist. They had no rights. They had no voice. And today, the Israeli state that says it speaks for the Jewish people and the American government are still treating the Palestinians as voiceless people with no rights, no agency, no political standing, as truants, as delinquents who need white old men from the north to come and watch over them and help them, just like the League of Nations tried to do in 1920. This is the colonial process in its purest form, and it's universal, it's timeless, and none of the laws and norms that were created after World War II in response to the genocide against the Jews in Germany and Europe and the earlier pogroms in Russia, none of that structure that tried to treat all people equally and decently is going to survive now, because the Israeli-American joint genocide is shredding international law and conventions and human rights protections, just like it's shredding babies sleeping in their tents at night in Gaza. And this has to stop, and it requires that the Israelis define and contain Zionism in a way that is compatible with Palestinian rights and a Palestinian state. The South Africans had to do the same thing, and they did it. But in Israel's case, it's tougher in many ways. So these are big issues. They're not going to be solved quickly, but Laurie asked, what's the solution? I think that's the solution, that both people's rights have to be recognized, and they'll have to negotiate how to do that. But the key is each side must recognize the most basic needs of the other, and then how to put that into a structure of statehood is a mutual statehood is the big challenge.
Mkhaimar, please.
Thank you, Asher. Let me just make a very short comment here. Now, I know that Atalia and Rami did very well on answering that question, but let me say the following. I mean, I don't want to dig deep into history about this Palestinian-Israeli conflict. We are all aware of the book written by Rashid Khaldi a few years ago about the 100 years conflict between the Palestinians and Israelis. And I think I do recommend reading that book for those who are interested in digging into that history. But let me say the following. Right now, there are 7 million Palestinians who live between the river and the sea. And there are also 7 million Israeli Jews who live also in the same territory between the Jordan River and the sea. And I think if we're going to leave it up to the extremists on both sides, on whether it's Israeli radical settlers and extreme right, or on the Palestinian side, Hamas and PIJ, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and other radicals, that will mean that that both Palestinians and Israelis will continue to kill each other for probably another 100 years or so. Now, the solution is on the table. Now, the UN, the international community has adopted the two-state solution as the only solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And I think if you ask both Palestinians and Israelis, and I have been following up on public opinion polls on both societies, and I think there is a majority on both, even it's a little bit problematic on the Israeli side, but there is a majority on both Palestinian and Israelis that a two-state solution is the only workable solution for this conflict. Now, I think what we need, probably what we need, is a courageous leadership on both, on Israel and Palestine, to step in and lead both nations, both Palestinian and Israelis, to put an end to this cycle of violence that has been going on for more than 100 years and adopt a two-state solution, which is, in my opinion, the only workable and acceptable solution to the majority of both Palestinian and Israelis.
Yes, a few more. Oh, Laurie wanted to say a few words. Go ahead, Laurie.
Just to say, as a professional mediator, that I have a kind of obligation to be optimistic. I'm also South African, so I've got some factual grounds to be optimistic. But I spent some time in Ramallah 2005 and 2007 working with the Palestinian Authority, and I've never been to a conflict at that time that I thought was less likely to be resolved. Every single factor that contributes to intractability and intransigence was present and remains present, if not deeper now than then. Despite that, conflicts that have appeared to be irresolvable have been resolved. Northern Ireland seemed to be irresolvable. South Africa seemed to be irresolvable. But they have been resolved. And really, the political calculation that's required for Israel-Palestine is no different. In the sense, to put it in the most simple, basic terms, both sides need to feel the allure, the pull of a sufficiently attractive vision of the future through a negotiated settlement. And they also have to feel the push of the pain of the current situation in the foreseeable future, which applies, I think, in this case, much more to Israel than to Palestinians because of the power asymmetry. If there is a decision on the part of the leadership of the two sides, pragmatically, to sort out the details of a settlement through negotiations, they'd be able to do this if they have the political will. So the mediator's perspective is that the devil is not actually in the detail. The devil is in political will. If you have the will to resolve the conflict, you'll figure it out with your enemy, not in the hope of achieving a beautiful, perfect deal, but a sufficiently tolerable, a sufficiently just deal. If they had the commitment to do that, I think they could do that. But this is not foreseeable, at least in the immediate future.
I just want to add, Laurie, that like you gave the case of South Africa, which of course you were embedded in, but in that case, it was, transformed because the people in the struggle named it for what it is. I mean, the struggle was against the system, apartheid, which also, as I mentioned in my remarks, there is consensus by international legal thinkers and human rights organizations that the whole geography I mean, the whole regime is guilty of the crime of apartheid, and it's not named because the peace discourse is with Palestine and Israel is grounded on kind of a segregationist logic. So if, like in the case of South Africa, imagine that the discourse would have been about, oh, we'll create like one white state and one black state. I mean, you had to name what you were, like what was at the root of it. And so I think there are important distinctions there to think about.
This might come as a comment now since you've already tackled the idea of how we can create a solution, but I like the irony and silliness of the situation here, like the Professor Kaufman just said, is that like wars now were basically started and ended with a phone call from Trump. And for now, I can't really, like the kind of academia logic and reason, or maybe the reason in negotiations or peace mediation kind of skipped me, because we have had this war for 2 years, basically out of nothing. It could have stopped, like negotiations were there. They were able to, at least they were like the Israeli government was able to at least reach some kind of agreement in November 2023, but they didn't. So, or sorry, November 2024, but they didn't. So maybe I want to zoom in on, what kind of options do you right now see for Hamas, for the Israeli government, and for this political dynamic that is currently there around the Palestinian rights? Can we actually have a solution? Because right now, I think policy or the political stance has failed us. So do you see a solution beyond that? Maybe like, I don't know, like the idea of having a solution with the current people in office or current people working the solution, negotiating, it's just something that I feel that's not going to be attainable. Thank you.
Rami has a solution for you.
Well, I have a suggestion, which is buy the book that we just wrote, because this goes into extensive details by serious scholars about what Hamas is. But what I add to that is Hamas represents political sentiments among Palestinians. You can destroy Hamas, but the popular sentiments would remain there. Hamas is still strong, not because of its military might, because it's the only Palestinian group in a constellation of Palestinian political groups that continues to resist politically, culturally, and militarily to achieve its rights. And what it wants to achieve is spelled out clearly in its program, which is now clear about coexistence with the Israeli state in some form, negotiated, only if the Palestinians get their rights. What makes Hamas different from the Fatah and the PLO and all the other groups that have been around for years is that it won't play these colonial games with Tony Blair and Jared Kushner and these guys. The other point is, if just take away the name Hamas, talk about the Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement. You can destroy the leadership, but the movement goes on because it's grounded in the sentiments of millions of people who've been abused. The same thing in South Africa, the South African nationalists, white and black, who were jailed or killed, but the movement continued. And Hamas is the same. So the Americans and Israelis are obsessed with Hamas because it fits into their simplistic, two-dimensional, cartoon-like good and bad views of the world. And it continues with the 20-point proposal by Trump that they have to be disarmed, they have to be de-radicalized, they have to be, well, just do some, do some genetic replacement if you want to get a whole new people. But if you're going to deal with the reality of the world as it is, the Palestinians are struggling, and this is what Hamas is saying. They're struggling for self-determination, end of occupation, end of subjugation, end of refugeehood, and restitution or reparation or negotiated resolution of their refugeehood. All all of those are doable things which could coexist with an Israeli state. If the Israelis would snap out of the zombie Zionist militarism that has engulfed them now and look at the world in the way that F.W. de Klerk did, Gorbachev did when he stepped down in Russia. I mean, people make, or Nixon in China, leaders who are realistic, see the realities of their world and make choices based on those that are good for their own people. There's nobody in Israel now that is doing this in a leadership position. Rabin got close, but he spent all his life killing Palestinians, unfortunately, and he may or may not have gone all the way to equal rights for both people, but we'll never know. He was the closest there was, and he's no longer there. So those are the points I would make. And focusing on Hamas is really a diversionary tactic, and this is what Zionism has always tried to do. And if you want to understand that well, you need to understand, you read Ilan Pappé's majestic book about Zionism lobbying history in England and the United States, and how they've always tried to do this to get you to focus on this or get focus on that, or what about human rights abuses in Burma? Why aren't you talking about those? We're saying all of those issues are valid, but we're Palestinians. We're discussing peace and rights for us, and we understand that this requires peace and rights for the Israelis, and we're prepared to do that, but only on an equal basis. No more playing colonial games.
I don't know if Mkhaimar, you want to say? I mean, I have different understandings of the way Hamas operates. I completely understand. I mean, Hamas operates within the context of the Palestinian struggle for self-determination. There's no question about that. And I support the Palestinian struggle for self-determination. I think this is the only way for Jewish self-determination to thrive in the land is through the realization of Palestinian self-determination. So that's my starting point. But within this context, I'm struggling to idealize the struggle of Hamas, the way it operates vis-a-vis other Palestinians, and the way it operates vis-a-vis Israel. And I mean, we already know that Hamas is the best thing that happened to Netanyahu. And this is why the focus on Hamas is so almost an obsession for Netanyahu and his government, because they need Hamas in order to continue this policy of delegitimizing Palestinian struggle. And again, having said that, I'm really, really careful in my assessment of Hamas in the way it operates. Like in my ideal world, after October 7th, we would have sat together, come up with some plan of reconstruction of the Gaza Strip, not 2 years after, when the Gaza Strip is completely in ruins and more than 60,000 people are dead. But reaching some kind of an agreement with Hamas that would also capitalize on the violence that Israel experienced on October 7th and build some kind of a new constructive change for Gaza and hope, I don't know, at least for Gaza. I think that was something that could have been achieved in, let's say, November, December 2023. But the Israeli government was not interested in that. And yeah. Mkhaimar, did you want to add anything?
Yes, thank you, Asher. Let me just add a few points here. Well, I don't want to sound like I'm disagreeing with my colleague Rami with regard to Hamas, but I think two things are working against Hamas right now. One is the attack on October 7 on Israel and what happened after that. I mean, that doesn't doesn't allow Hamas to be part of the game, at least for now. And the other thing, I have to be honest with you, the majority of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. Now, I know that following up on Palestinian public opinion polls, Hamas still has a good majority among the Palestinians in the West Bank, but not in Gaza. I don't think that the Palestinians in Gaza would like to see Hamas in any political role right now, because part of the Palestinians in Gaza are blaming Hamas for provoking Israel into this war of destruction. And another issue, I have to be honest with you, Rami, and I may disagree with you. Yes, Hamas has revised its 1988 charter, which was described as anti-Semitic charter, and it was very much anti-Israel because it called for the destruction of Israel and the establishment of a Palestinian state from the river to the sea. And that charter of 1988 was very much revised in its 2017 a new document, which called the New Principles document of May 2017. But even in that new document of 2017, yes, Hamas has accepted in writing that they accept the establishment of a Palestinian state on the 1967 borders, but they didn't say anything about and they did even say that they're not going to recognize Israel. They're not going to recognize the existence of Israel, which means that they accept the establishment of a Palestinian state on the 1967 borders, but they do not accept the two-state solution. And so I don't think that Hamas is maybe after this war, and I have been following up on some of their leaders' statements about the day after. Maybe they are willing to moderate their views much more in the coming period. But as I mentioned, after what happened on October 7 and what happened in Gaza, that doesn't make them in a position to even negotiate with Israel. And the other problem that is facing the Palestinians, unfortunately, that the current Palestinian leadership represented by President Mahmoud Abbas and the senior Palestinian leaders are not trustworthy also by the Palestinians. There is a lot of or negative sentiments toward the PA and its current leadership because of corruption charges and because of even an aging leadership that isn't willing to reform the Palestinian Authority. I think what the Palestinians probably need now, it's not going to happen today. What we need is within a year to allow the Palestinians to go into a new presidential and parliamentary elections, which will give the Palestinian the right to choose a new leadership that is capable of making peace with Israel in the future.
I want to ask you about your assessment on the role of the European Union. I'm from Germany, and this government is at the forefront of supporting the genocide, and usually the political leaders' argument with historical responsibility. However, the current chancellor, a couple of weeks, Friedrich Merz, he said Israel is doing the dirty work of the Western allies. That was the literal translation. So I wonder what you think of their role in all of that.
Let's go to Palestinian colleagues. Let's go to Palestinian colleagues.
Yeah. Do you want to make a comment on the EU? And it's Rami or Mkhaimar?
I can make a quick comment. It's no accident that two of the world's prize winners in genocide and colonialism, Germany and the United Kingdom, are leading the European position vis-a-vis the current situation, the genocide. And I wouldn't think that all Germans or all British people act the same way as their government does. But it's no surprise, the colonial spirit that is deep inside many people in the North and the West takes a long time to be cleansed and cleaned, and people to stop being colonialists. And unfortunately, the Europeans have pulled themselves out of the process of seeking genuine, equitable, permanent peace between Israelis and Palestinians. They were pioneers back in the 70s and 80s, and when they were the first people to talk of Palestinian self-determination in the West. I don't remember which year it was, I think late 70s. But in the last 30, 40 years, they've just been busy making cores and selling weapons and stuff. So Europe has relinquished its role as a global leader in political justice, unfortunately. They talk about it, they give money to NGOs, they do a lot of things, but in action, they still act in a colonial way. And even those states that recognized Palestinian statehood on paper in the last couple of months added little riders to it that if they do this, we will recognize them. And they're only doing this recognition because they want to avoid being sent to The Hague as complicit in genocide. So I think we need to be careful with how we assess people's actions. But the final statement I would make is I need to go to another event. The litmus test of peace in the Middle East and justice is not Arab recognition of Israel. The litmus test is mutual recognition by Israelis and Palestinians of equal and simultaneous rights to nationhood, justice, peace, security, legitimacy, and development. If those are not equal and simultaneous, then very little progress is going to be made. And I think we should all figure out a way to do that.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you for your participation via Zoom, Rami and Mkhaimar. Thank you for the panelists here with us, and thank you for you all for your patience and attention to our conversation. I hope the next panel on this situation, Israel-Palestine, will be a little bit more optimistic, but I don't hold my breath. Thank you.